Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, I'll try not to break it.
Yeah, that's the other.
Yeah. Morning, Emil. A moment of truth. Actually, that's the point. We don't have any note paper.
I'll share.
I've got a pen. Yeah, I'll just do this. Yeah, all right. That'll be fine. No, I know exactly. Yeah, I always had a bit of a problem with that one.
Smart. Good.
There were days when there was 4 different people.
Level. Okay.
Can't do that anymore. Actually, this is quite good because mostly it's a real audience, not just us padding out the crowd.
Good morning and welcome to the launch of Strategic Survey 2015, the annual review of world affairs. Joining me to answer questions today are Nigel Inkster, Mark Fitzpatrick, Emil Hokaim, and Sam Charap. Strategic unease is the defining feature of the international security climate. The rules-based order to which Western leaders cling is increasingly being challenged. Rule breaking is not being effectively deterred. Facts on the ground, sea, air, and in cyberspace are being created that confront rather than reinforce established norms. The European security order has been rocked by a self-confident Russian leadership that, despite being subjected to heavy international sanctions, has asserted its regional national interests with vigor. China has methodically asserted its claims in the South China Sea, as have other claimant states, and back these up with the development in some cases of militarily relevant installations. Unconvinced of the competence or fairness of Western financial institutions, China's creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank points to a desire to design some of its own architecture with its own rules. An altogether new challenge has come in the shape of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS, which has been able to seize and hold territory as well as mines in the Middle East and way beyond. Wielding the promise of a caliphate, this neo-state with organized conventional warfighting capacities needs to be aggressively contained, yet mustering a common and effective response between states with competing interests and approaches has proved elusive. Simultaneous strategic unease in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia is taxing the international system immensely. Deterrence, containment, balance of power are all high-maintenance strategies, and the United States, having managed these in the past, is pressed to conduct them simultaneously across 3 theaters. In a fragmenting world order, the quality of regional leadership is being tested and generally found wanting. Perhaps this sense of strategic unease is most pervasive in the Middle East. Political resolution of the wars in Yemen, Libya, and Syria is highly unlikely. Battle fatigue may be a more important factor in limiting the effects of these conflicts. The international coalition against ISIS is frail, ensuring that the group will remain an enduring feature of the Middle East strategic landscape. The ideational and security challenges it poses may be most important in the neighborhood, but extend beyond it. Leaders in Southeast Asia openly expressed their concern that ungoverned spaces could fall under the control of ISIS-inspired groups. Severing its lines of communication and supply, limiting the foreign fighter flow and choking off its financial support, attacking with precision its commanders and fighters, and training local forces to confront it more effectively are all rightly part of the strategic mix. But the campaign is naturally hampered by the absence of political solutions to the wars flaring in the region and the limitations, both professional and otherwise, of local forces. The nuclear agreement with Iran, concluded on 14 July, will lead to complex hedging and even more strategic unease. The deal will be invested by many in the international community with a strategic importance that far exceeds its specific frame of reference. Properly implemented, the accord will ensure that there is no risk of Iran developing a nuclear weapon for 15 years. And in that period, assuming satisfactory compliance, the Iranian economy will progressively be freed of the constraints imposed by UN and other sanctions. The Israeli government immediately judged the deal a mistake. For a number of Gulf Arab states, the readmission of Iran into the international community opens the door for the Revolutionary Guards and other forces in Iran to invest in regional destabilization. They fear that Iran might have a freer and better financed hand to continue a policy of interference in the region, and that there will be more pressure to cede to Iran a greater regional role. That perception alone will cause important strains. Iran's regional activities will inevitably come under even more careful scrutiny. Efforts to win a wider détente with Iran will be exceptionally hard, as will attempts to ensure its constructive engagement on conflict resolution throughout the Middle East. The sense of strategic unease in Asia is also palpable, as the region absorbs the truth of China's strategic arrival as a self-confident and increasingly extrovert power. Australia's strategic bipolarity, an economic relationship that is biggest with China and a security relationship that is principally with the United States, is one increasingly shared by others in the region. There is a natural win-win, to use China's most deployed slogan, in the economic growth of China and the corresponding economic growth that most other countries in the Asia-Pacific are positioned to enjoy as part of China's steady development. Yet on the sensitive issues of territorial claims and the manner in which these are asserted and discussed, the win-win paradigm seems much less evident. Territorial rivalries have much more of a zero-sum character to them. The previous tendency to put disputes to one side while cooperation continued has been replaced by a desire to assert not just rights, but control over disputed territory that runs against the ethos of cooperation. The Chinese Defense White Paper, released in May 2015, can be read as a foundational text for a China now more willing and able to defend its security interests in the Asia-Pacific, including on territorial questions. Other regional states will wish to defend their interests. Strategic friction will remain a problem, and the balancing role of the US will be acutely important. Doubts about whether Europe can recreate the structures for effective cooperation with Russia while deterring Russian provocation are the principal cause of strategic unease on the continent, especially its eastern half. The Russian leadership has operated opportunistically, at speed, using all instruments of state power to assert its interest in Ukraine and to indicate its support for Russians living in other countries. Russian military activity close to the borders of NATO states, as well as an evolving military doctrine that places more emphasis on nuclear weapons at the core of national strategy, requires NATO to take measures to reassure allies and show determination to defend NATO territory. Long accustomed to living with a post-Cold War peace dividend, Europeans will again be hearing their leaders speak of the need to offer a robust response to Russian assertiveness. As the machinery of NATO gets tuned up again and re-oiled, it will be necessary to avoid simply repeating the containment policies of the past. European leaders will have to find a way to manage the relationship with Russia firmly, but in a manner that invites genuine discussion of a political settlement in the eastern half of Europe that can calm tensions. A weak containment policy, unconnected to a political strategy towards Russia, will not be satisfactory. As this long-term strategy is developed, European leaders will also have to be alert to their responsibilities to engage constructively in Africa and the Middle East. The spread of ungoverned or maliciously governed spaces to Europe's south is a major strategic challenge, and political leaders will need to act with finesse and agility to help stabilize these areas. As a number of European countries, notably the UK and Germany and the EU itself, conduct strategic defense reviews, these uncertainties to the east and to the south must inspire the best strategic thinking possible. Given this level of generalized strategic unease, strategic surprise is to be expected. In the Middle East, the ideational struggle is so powerful and the promoters of violence so various that in effect the region and its neighbors are in a regular state of constant alert. In Asia, strategic surprise is most likely from an angry North Korea that may suddenly, to grab attention, launch a missile, or test a nuclear device. A strong dialogue between the US, the Republic of Korea, Japan, China, and Russia remains essential to ensure the Korean Peninsula remains a managed problem. China's international geoeconomic policy, and in particular its One Belt, One Road ambitions, will have it increasingly engaged in many parts of the world, often as a result shaping national and regional politics. Japan is still struggling to gain regional acceptance of its attempted return to normal power status, and India is tending to its neighborhood as it prepares in time to take a leading power role. Increasingly, what these Asian powers think will be a point of reference for others. They will become as important economic and political counterparts for many states in Africa and Latin America as North American and European states have been in the past. Yet they will not be important guarantors of security extra-regionally for a very long time, nor leading organizers of effective collective security endeavors. Sadly, there are now more exporters of insecurity than exporters of strategic stability. And so Strategic Survey 2015 concludes that strategic unease will persist for some time. And indeed, the international strategic scene is shifting so importantly that the International Institute for Strategic Studies is now conducting its own sweeping strategic review of our research priorities. And by the end of the year, we intend to have our own campaign plan to deliver the research and analysis across all of our platforms that effectively address the policy issues thrown up by the world and analyzed in this year's strategic survey. We're very happy to take questions on this statement, on what's in the book, and indeed on what might be on your mind today. Jonathan, yes, microphone's just coming to you.
Richard Norton, The Guardian. Could I ask, do you think ISIS could be defeated under current Western strategy, or put it the other way, will the West have to change their policy if ISIS is going to be defeated, ever?
Thank you. Emil Huckheim first, then Nigel Inster.
The current strategy to defeat ISIS is fundamentally flawed and needs to be revamped. But the notion that Russia can be a central player in this campaign is very problematic. If anything, cooperation between the West and Russia against ISIS will only validate ISIS narrative and actually help to mobilize even greater numbers in support of ISIS. At the end of the day, it's important to understand that while many in the West may see ISIS as the greater evil, most Syrians continue to see Bashar al-Assad as the greater threat, and for good reason. He's the main cause of death, destruction, and displacement in Syria today. So it's very unclear how the Russian strategy on ISIS will unfold, and there are several dangers here, including the fact that Russia has a quite broad definition of what is a Islamist worth fighting. Russia may start by targeting ISIS and then move on to Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, Liwa al-Haq, Jaish al-Islam, all groups that are not necessarily the ones I would like to see govern those countries, but they are quite in the mainstream in Syria, and these are not the groups that the current coalition wants to fight as part of the anti-ISIS strategy. So there is a risk here, and Western options are constrained, but certainly following the Russian lead is not going to be a solution. If anything, it's going to add fuel to the fire.
It's understandable and perhaps politically necessary for Western leaders to talk about defeating Islamic State, but I think the reality is that Islamic State is a problem that is going to have to be managed for some time to come. Their advance in Iraq may have been stalled due to the actions that have been taken, but the fact remains that they are in effective control of quite a large chunk of territory. They are delivering services to the population, albeit in a somewhat uneven manner, and many of these services which they claim to be providing are simply ones that they've inherited from the previous regime. But they are, I think, in some qualitative senses, different from what we've had before, and I think we're going to have to take account of that in developing strategies for dealing with this. I don't think they're going away anytime soon.
Yes?
Cho, Asia and Pacific Affairs. I wonder if the panel could throw a bit of light on relations between Beijing and Moscow. Recent naval exercises in the Med between the two countries, naval exercises in the Far East, and the appearance of Chinese service ships off Alaska, and the recent purchase by PLA of S-400 anti-aircraft system, the best and the latest the Russians got. Is that something worth looking into?
Sam Chao?
Since the Ukraine crisis began, Russia-China relations have become significantly closer, and previously existing barriers to cooperation have come down, particularly on the Russian side. So you've seen a lot of concessions made that were resisted in the past on any number of areas, from energy to arms sales, such as the one that you mentioned, to infrastructure projects within Russia. So previously, basically, China hadn't been involved in any of them, and now nominally they'll be building a high-speed railway between Moscow and Kazan. And this is of strategic significance, certainly. How far it goes is another question entirely, and I think the important question here is the frame in which we ask it. So do we look at this relationship like we look at Western alliances? If we judge it by that score, then of course it's not going to meet that standard. If we judge it by the way Russia-China relations were before this shift, then we can clearly see a significant development. So I think, yes, it's important, but you give the example of the S-400. Even in that case, there are still limits. So the anti-aircraft missiles that were actually allowed to be sold were not the most high-tech ones, even though the system itself was delivered. So I don't think we're looking at an alliance like the kind that exists between, say, the UK and the US, but the relationship has, of course, become much closer.
Nigel?
Yeah, it's long been an article of faith in Chinese foreign policy that China doesn't do alliances. That has been a kind of formal position for quite some time. However, it's worth remembering that as with so many other things in China, there is a debate going on that continues to go on about whether China should in fact rethink that approach and move in the direction of alliances, or at least strong partnerships with certain countries. Because one of the other articles of faith about China is that it is, and this is true, is that it feels surrounded by states, encircled by states that it does not necessarily take to be friendly. So I think there is potentially quite a lot of give, a lot of evolution in the Chinese position. And in long-term strategic perspectives, I think China feels that it's able to deal with a country like Russia from a position of relative strength. The days of the 1950s when China was heavily dependent upon Soviet economic and technical assistance are long gone. I think it's only a matter of probably not that much time before, for example, the Chinese arms manufacturing industry catches up and probably surpasses that of Russia. So I think that in some of these regards, China is feeling stronger and more self-confident. Also, of course, China needs Russian support for things like its one belt, one road policy, a policy which I think Russia still has quite significant reservations about. I think we'll see the situation evolving. I don't think we can simply take comfort in the old certainties about how this relationship is. The fact is that in both cases they have, as Sam said, put some long-standing suspicions on hold in pursuit of mutual interest, one of which, of course, is about opposing US activities around the world and, at the end of the day, working to make the world safe for autocracy.
Yes.
Uchenna Izindu from Jane's Intelligence Review. I was hoping the panel could shed some light on what event surprised you the most in carrying out the strategic survey and how you think that might pan out for 2016.
I might invite the editor of Strategic Survey, Alex Nichol, just to give us his thoughts on what surprised him.
Thank you very much for that question. Strategic Survey covers the 12 months from mid-year to mid-year. So I don't know who asked the question. I couldn't see. Oh, there you are, sorry. It covers the 12 months from mid-year to mid-year. And actually, in those 12 months, we've seen quite a few kind of landmark events. We've seen the Iranian nuclear agreement. We've seen Cuban reconciliation with the United States. We've seen the Ebola outbreak in Africa. Quite a few really important events. But I think we've also seen during this year, as John has indicated, the continuation of really very worrying trends that show no sign of resolution in the near future, and really could get worse. And I think we're seeing it particularly in Europe now. I think in Europe we've seen some really surprising events, not least in this country. The future of Europe is really sort of up for grabs right now. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my attempt.
Yes? Anton LaGuardia.
Anton LaGuardia, The Economist. I wanted to go back to a point made by Emil and by Nigel. If, you said that ISIS would be with us for some time to come. The question is, can the states of Iraq and Syria ever be reconstituted? If not, what are the consequences of a semi-permanent or a permanent ISIS? Not just for years, but for much longer than that.
Emil?
We're witnessing the de facto partition, self-partition of both Syria and Iraq. I think forces within those countries have become a bit less ambitious in terms of the territory they seek to conquer, that's besides ISIS, and are focusing on consolidating internally. So, for instance, the Kurds in Syria have been key in rolling back ISIS from the region bordering Turkey. But they have no intention of going to Raqqa, the heart of the Islamic State, and defeating it there. It makes no sense. They want to spend their resources and their time building a de facto statelet. We see similar dynamics in Iraq. I would argue that the Shia militias that rose in mid-2014 to also fight ISIS have realized that it is going to be a very difficult struggle, and they're more interested in winning the political battles in Baghdad, which will lead to the weakening of the Iraqi state. And we see in Syria as well the Assad regime basically retrenching and focusing on the core areas from Damascus to the coastal areas. I think that a formal breakup is unlikely, but what is happening on the ground is a de facto partition that basically is going to be pretty bloody, very violent as we see. I would argue that the landscape of the Levant has already been fundamentally changed. One final example is the case of Lebanon. The big fear in Lebanon for many centuries was that of sudden and massive demographic shifts. Now, for all purposes, Lebanon is a Sunni majority country, while for a very long time the dominant community was a Shia one. That's because of Syrian refugees. Of course, we think here of them as refugees. We're not going to count them as residents. But when you look at the weakening of borders and when you look at those transnational dynamics, it doesn't mean much anymore. So you have one country that, whose face has fundamentally been changed in a matter of years. And I think this is here to last.
Maybe I'll ask Emil a question, and that is this. If these two countries are self-petitioning, what should be the attitude of the outside powers that have traditionally played a big role in Iraq and in the Levant in respect of that self-partitioning? Should they still hang on to the fiction of the territorial integrity of these states, or should they assist that self-partitioning in a way that creates a better measure of stability?
those states are not, I mean, I understand that there is a lot of discussion in here and even in the Arab world about, you know, how Western intervention shaped artificial states. It wasn't really the case to start. And second, those states have taken a life of their own. And I don't think that it is the place of Western governments to endorse and act, you know, the partition and somehow contribute to it. It is going to be a very painful process, and certainly strong central governments in Syria and Iraq are a thing of the past. So we're managing the demise of those states, but there's still a sense of identity in those places, of national identity, even though right now people are seeking protection in, you know, subnational and transnational groups. But I don't think it's the role of external actors to give their imprimatur to that partition.
Yes, please. Wait. Could you take the microphone, please? Thank you.
Kamya from Iran, Iranian online magazine Kayhan. Based on a Iran deal, the Congress can stop the deal, not yet, but in future, I don't know what's happening. This is what's a view for the, and is Iran deal can change the Iran role in Syria and Iraq, or still Gulf states defending this position from Iran?
Thank you. I think there are two questions there. The first is, what is the continuing role of the US Congress on this nuclear file issue? And secondly, what does this mean for regional security? So on those 2 points, I'll ask Mark Fitzpatrick to give his view on each of those 2 points, and perhaps Emile also on the regional issue.
Thanks. I was afraid I wouldn't get a question. The congressional review period hits its deadline on Thursday, and of course there will not be a congressional vote of disapproval. The supporters of the deal have already got the numbers to prevent that from happening, and added, of course, to that was Republican infighting that made it impossible. But Republicans are now looking at a plan B to try to impede implementation of the deal by imposing new sanctions. Well, some of them would say the point is not to impede the deal, but to strengthen the deal by imposing new sanctions or by imposing new requirements. I suspect that the Democrats, having maintained solidarity in preserving the deal now, will not in subsequent months change tact and go along with anything that would scuttle the deal. But your second question raises the possibility of external events impacting on the dynamics in Washington and elsewhere. If Iran were to increase its support for Assad in ways that would visually allow him to expand the slaughter of civilians, if the differences between Iran and the United States in how to conduct the campaign against ISIS and how to strengthen the unity of the Iraqi state, if those differences were to expand in a way that creates headlines and so forth, you could generate additional momentum in the United States to say, we've got to do something to constrain Iran by imposing new sanctions on activity unrelated to the nuclear front. I think that's a real possibility.
Emile?
Thank you. The nuclear deal is great news on the proliferation front, but I would like to just make that note of caution that there is a tendency to overstate the potential regional security benefits of the deal. We don't see a change in Iranian behavior. In fact, we see Iranian doubling down on support for Assad. And the Iranian campaign against ISIS in Iraq is having a very problematic impact on political dynamics in Baghdad. And we saw this recently with real tensions between Abadi, the prime minister, and Maliki and the Shia militias known as Hashd al-Sha'bi, in Iraq. There is no sign that Iran is about to, shift its position on any of those two crises. And if anything, regional actors believe that if Iran is escalating, they too have to escalate. And there's a dangerous dynamic here, which is that the United States, to some extent, is compelled, or maybe compelled, to accept that kind of escalation as, you know, a consequence of the deal to keep it alive. So I would argue that the regional security picture still is very troubled. We can't blame the deal for it, and we can't credit the deal for positive things yet. But we're a long way ahead from a resolution that really involves Iran.
Anyone else? Yes?
It sounds a pretty depressing outlook. Are there any reasons to be cheerful, do you think, for the year ahead?
Not the Middle East.
Okay. All right. Well,
No,
Mark.
the question was asked, what surprised us this year? And Alex Nicol mentioned the Iran deal as one of those surprises. I was surprised that the parties reached a resolution on the issue that could have brought the United States into another major conflict in the Middle East. That has now been put off for the period of time that the deal will be faithfully implemented, inshallah. So that's a very positive outlook. Now, you know, each of us in the Institute have our own personal perspectives. I look at things from a non-proliferation perspective, and that's, you know, as Emil said, it's definitely a plus. The Iran deal also has the potential to be a game changer in other ways. It could go negative for the reasons Emil said, but it could also, by increasing the possibilities for communication between Iran and Western countries with whom it has been at odds, these new communication channels open up the possibility for engaging Iran positively in addressing the problems in its neighborhood. I'm not predicting that it will all be positive, but there is a potential for this being a game changer. I think we should recognize that.
Thank you. That's important. Yes.
Jonathan Rugman from Channel 4 News. Just returning to Syria, we're approaching the year anniversary of British airstrikes in Iraq. The Prime Minister is at least contemplating expanding them to Syria. I wondered if your opinion as to whether that was part of a viable strategy and what we should be doing that we're not doing to combat ISIS.
Emil first.
In my first answer, I argued that the strategy against ISIS is fundamentally flawed, and I'll expand on this right now. The way the French, British, Australian decision to send more drones and aircraft is being portrayed is as if the problem against ISIS is one of capacity. It is not one of capacity. It's one of strategy. Basically, since the conflict in Syria started, Western decision makers in particular have run away from hard, difficult decisions. And we saw this for the past few years. Because of fatigue, because of desire not to be entangled in the Middle Eastern, another Middle Eastern conflict. The cost of that inaction and the cost of, also I would argue, problematic hopes placed on diplomacy and what Iran and Russia would do and not do, etc., has led to the catastrophic consequences. Is one of the factors that led to the catastrophic humanitarian situation we see today. The strategy against ISIS is underperforming and is counterproductive at many levels. We assess in strategic survey that ISIS has expanded the territory it controls in Syria by a factor of 2. In Iraq, yes, there's the victory of Tikrit. Now the city is flattened, but there's the loss of Ramadi. ISIS is still fighting hard in Baiji, and Mosul is a place to be recaptured, in a very long time. It's no longer in the cards. So all the indicators are there that the strategy is not working well. Now, if you want to contain ISIS, what you need is a sustained, very expensive air campaign and the Kurds. And you have to do what it takes politically to keep the Kurds on your side. Now, if you want to defeat ISIS, and if you want to prevent it from expanding in Sunni Arab areas, you need Sunni Arabs. And if you want to get Sunni Arabs on board, you need a political and military strategy to address the fate of Assad. And we're still running away from that hard truth because it will come at a cost. It will be very difficult to pursue as a strategy. But what's happening right now is not something that will address the fundamental problem, and it will not reduce the threat of ISIS. As long as we don't accept that for most Syrians, Assad is a much greater threat, we're not going to be able to shift loyalties in Syria and fight that. I want to just end on one point. These days, we talk very positively, and this is very fair, about the contribution of the Kurds against ISIS. A great development. But the greatest setback that ISIS suffered since its creation came at the hands of mainstream and Islamist Syrian rebels in the first 6 months of 2014, when there was no international coalition against ISIS. This is when ISIS was pushed away from most of north and northeastern Syria. We did nothing then, and we demonized some of those rebels, and ISIS came back stronger because it was able to obtain the loyalty of some of these groups. The strategy is fundamentally flawed. It is not a question of capacity.
Nigel?
Yeah, I think I would entirely agree with what Emil has to say. I think one of the problems that we tend to have with ISIS is that the focus on the extreme ideology of the movement, the extreme religiosity, the eschatology, all the other things that we know, tend to make it difficult for us to actually look at IS as a kind of rational political actor. But that is what it is. And a lot of the religiosity is simply a glue that hold things together. The formula for Islamic State is ideology, religious fervor, plus, in the case of Iraq, Ba'athist organizational skills, which are considerable. So we need to look at IS in a very different way from simply another bunch of terrorists who, if left unattended, will start engaging in atrocities in our country. And I agree with Emil that what we need is an effective containment strategy that does actually rely very heavily on more sustained aerial deployments, and maybe who knows, the creation even of safe havens or of no-fly zones and safe havens.
Yes.
Dominic Dudley, a freelance journalist. In regard to Saudi Arabia and its allies that are involved in the Yemen conflict, how do you see that, their involvement there, their experiences there affecting their ability and willingness to get involved in other fights around the rest of the region?
Emil?
Yet another war. The Gulf-led intervention in Yemen was quite an unprecedented undertaking for these states. They totally own it. They're not operating as part of a coalition that Western countries are leading. And they're intervening in Yemen, a country whose population is that of the 6 GCC states combined. With a very complex fabric. The coalition faced real military and political challenges early on, and although Saudi Arabia and the UAE were able to build quite an impressive coalition regionally, and of course there was skepticism in the West about deep skepticism of what they're doing, but that was an achievement. They suffered militarily at the beginning. It was difficult to see progress. But in reality, since July and the takeover of Aden, or the liberation of Aden by Gulf-supported Yemenis and Gulf forces, including very well-performing UAE units, the coalition has performed militarily better. I think the real challenge is elsewhere. I mean, now they're going up to Ma'arib, and there's the question of the siege of Sana'a, which would be a massive undertaking, and that would come at a huge humanitarian cost. I mean, the humanitarian cost is already very high, but try to imagine what the siege of Sana'a will entail. But what the Gulf states are facing right now is a challenge of stabilization. They basically own Yemen, a country of 24 million. Compared to the UK and the US and Iraq and Afghanistan, those two countries had experience, expertise, they had the funding mechanisms, there was something they could work with, and it didn't work that well. The Gulf states have the advantage of, one, first speaking the language, second, cultural awareness, third, massive financial means, resources to deploy it. And they're going to have to live with Yemen for a very long time. So they're totally committed to the task, but they don't necessarily have the mechanisms, the strategy, the experience in stabilization. And that's the huge challenge we see now, that regions that have been freed from Houthi rebels and their allies, Saleh, etc., are not stable yet. I mean, Aden is an example, and it's going to be difficult to do so. So the trick for the Gulf states is to figure out a way to involve the international community in a political settlement in Yemen, and hopefully soon before a big battle for Sana'a. And in this way, you involve the international community in the stabilization of Yemen. The signs are not that good these days, so but there is a greater awareness of the challenges down the road.
Yes.
Richard Neal, I'm a freelance journalist. How serious is the threat of ISIS in Libya? How effective the international strategy in combating it? And what's the risk of a spread to the rest of North Africa?
Emil and Nigel?
Come to the Middle East, there are other things to do than war. Look, ISIS is expanding in Libya and now controls almost two cities, Sirte and Derna, and has been able to actually defeat some coalitions that were mounted by other Libyan groups, or at least stop their attempts to retake those cities. Libya is a very fertile ground for ISIS, and we shouldn't only look at ISIS in the Libyan context. I mean, ISIS poses a threat to nearby Tunisia and to nearby Egypt, and so there is a lot of talk in the region now of a possible intervention led by Egypt in Libya to get rid of ISIS. Of course, the situation in Libya is extremely complex because you also have two governments. I mean, there was good news a couple of days ago from De Leon, the UN envoy. There's supposedly an agreement on a unity government that would then help create the conditions for a united front against ISIS. The problem with ISIS really is to its immediate neighborhood, Tunisia, but also Algeria, which might be the new front there.
Can I just state the obvious, which is that there's an awful lot of information in this year's strategic survey on these conflicts in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, a lot of detail on how the battlegrounds have shifted. But there's even more detail, of course, in the Institute's Armed Conflict database, which is now being updated on a weekly basis. We published earlier this year, Nigel Inkster launched it, our armed conflict survey, but that database is updated weekly, and I would recommend as many of you who are interested in the detail of these conflicts to subscribe to it and use it for your own work. I might just ask a question of Sam Charap, since I asked one of Emil, which is, might you give our audience an assessment of where we are in the Minsk II process and what you foresee as the diplomatic track in the next weeks and months on the Ukraine conflict?
So there is some good news to report, I guess, on this score, in that since September 1st, we've basically had a ceasefire for the first time in Ukraine since April 2014. And there's a marked decrease in fatalities and casualties on the line of contact. The extent to which this is sustainable is an open question right now. And the next threshold or watershed moment will be on October 2nd, when the presidents of the so-called Normandy Four, that is Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, meet in Paris to discuss the future of the process. I think at the moment they're facing a deadline imposed by the Minsk process itself, which is December 31st, and there's a lot that has not been accomplished, particularly on the political, but also on the ground, on the military front, between now and then, and actually getting to that December 31st deadline while accomplishing all that needs to happen, including local elections, constitutional reform, devolution of authority, and eventual Russian withdrawal and return of control over the border, is an extremely tall order. So the question of extending timelines is already coming up. I think between now and when decisions on that are made, we're likely to see on both sides and all sides trying to test each other and see whether there's sincerity about actually implementing the document as written. I think we can hope that that will lead to full implementation and a sustainable peace and political settlement. I think that is probably a low probability at this point, given where the politics are. But nonetheless, at least in the last couple of weeks, there have been cautiously positive developments. I would say, though, that in the longer term, has yet to be a fundamental meeting of the minds, even on the question of what the future of Ukraine will look like if this document is implemented. The way Ukrainian politicians talk about it and the way the Russian leadership talks about it are very different things. So we shall see. I think October 2nd will be an interesting moment to see whether this process has legs and whether or not timelines can be extended beyond the end of the year.
We'll take two more. First you, and then we'll end with you. Yes.
Juan Carlos Bejarano from RCA in Colombia. There is a new crisis between Venezuela and Colombia. Rhetorical for the time being, this conflict. However, Colombians seem to think that President Maduro is trying to provoke President Santos, and there is an ongoing sentiment in Colombia that Colombians think that we have to teach Venezuelans a lesson and go and fight in Venezuela. Do you think it's possible a military conflict between Colombia and Venezuela, even if it's a short term?
Well, I saw that a very distinguished UK strategist 2 days ago tweeted the question, might there be a military conflict between Venezuela and Colombia, Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman of King's College. So people who are normally focused on the problems of Europe, the Middle East and Asia have been alert to this growing tension between Colombia and Venezuela. And of course, in each of the two countries, domestic politics plays a very important role. The meetings that took place with Ecuador's mediation have not yet led to a possibility for the two presidents to meet. I think what this crisis also demonstrates, though, is the fragility of the regional security arrangements in South America. UNASUR has not really been able to rise to the challenge of being able to assist the two countries in calming tensions between them. And I think it will be an important element of Colombia's diplomacy in the next 3 to 6 months to find how it can reinvigorate the OAS, UNASUR, the other organizations that have traditionally sought to play a diplomatic mediation role, and to gain more allies in the region to assist the calming of tensions. My own gut instinct is that there won't be an important military conflict between the two countries, because neither will gain much advantage for it. But there really needs to be a more inventive mechanism for diplomatic mediation between the two. Nigel, do you have any?
Yeah, I'd simply add that Colombia has a very substantial vested interest in not going down the military route, because, of course, Venezuelan support for the ongoing peace talks with FARC is an important component. Indeed, I would argue it's one of the critical components that brought FARC to the negotiating table in the first place. Now, those negotiations are going very slowly, I would say almost painfully slowly, and I, for one, am beginning to wonder whether this dynamic is shifting, and the kind of steam is going out of this exercise, which, were that to happen, would be a very unfortunate development. So I would have thought that President Santos, at least, has got a powerful vested interest in not going down the military route.
Yes, last one. Thank you.
Dominic Wag on Sky News. Samuel, what's your best guess at what Vladimir Putin's up to in Syria at the moment?
So I think it's important to think about this from how it's seen from Moscow. I think from their perspective, they're choosing between an eventual negotiated outcome involving a strong Assad regime that preserves their interests in Syria's future, or US-led regime change that produces at best chaos and at worst an IS-led Syria. That's might be wrong, but I think that's sort of how it's seen in Moscow. So from that, perspective, given recent developments on the ground, I think there are a number of motives in play that explain what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. First, establishing a position of strength to bring Russia to the center of any potential future negotiation. Second, deterring and preventing potential regime change in the future. Also, in that context, preventing the regime falling to ISIS, which of course is something that Russia wouldn't want. But also, I think it's an attempt to counter what Russia sees as stepped up external intervention from the enemies of its proxy. So that is recent increase in Saudi, Turkish, Qatari support for their proxy. This, I don't think, will accomplish very much, except for incurring the ire of not only many in the Arab world, but many in the West. And it's sort of too small to have a militarily significant impact on the ground, except perhaps to deter Western intervention, maybe. But just big enough to be highly provocative.
So I realize there's a question I missed there, please. Yes, thank you.
Lucia Ring-Watkins, China Central Television. May I ask, what will be the impact, if any, of the recent influx of refugees on Europe?
Nigel.
Well, I think, as Alex had said earlier, Europe is finding itself being tested on a number of fronts at the moment, and I think this is certainly an issue that is testing European commitment to what are still some fairly embryonic institutions and arrangements. The numbers coming to Europe are such that arguably a coherent and coordinated European response that dealt with these refugees centrally and kind of shared them out between 28 states ought in principle to make this problem eminently manageable, but as we have seen, there is little sign of any such arrangement falling into place. And what we've seen is a number of countries, Germany having initially enthusiastically welcomed large numbers of Syrian refugees, has now, as it's entitled to do under the Schengen arrangement, invoked temporary border controls, and we're seeing a number of other European countries follow the same route. So I think this is going to be a test of European solidarity that it's not yet a foregone conclusion that the mandatory quota system will fail, but I suspect the likelihood of it failing is pretty high, in which case what's going to happen is a continuation of the unsatisfactory muddled through policies that are effectively what we've got at the moment. I mean, statistically, these numbers ought not to be that significant in terms of Europe's overall population, and indeed there are many countries in Europe that are rapidly greying and would welcome an influx of talent, and many of the Syrian refugees that we are seeing, these are from the aspirational upwardly mobile middle classes. They're educated, they've spent time waiting in refugee camps around Syria in the hope that they would be able to go back quite soon. They've now effectively given up, they've abandoned their country, and what we are now seeing in Syria, one of the deleterious consequences of this whole thing is a massive brain drain, and a generational move out of the country. So that is a loss for Syria. Now there is of course a worry that amongst these refugees, there could be Islamic State sleeper cells, and this seems to be a particular preoccupation for the United States, which is talking about taking, I think, 10,000 refugees, but US Congress seems to be convulsed about the possibility that amongst these, this will be a Trojan horse for Islamic State sleeper cells. We can't discard that possibility. I would only submit that the security threat from Islamic State at the moment actually comes from people that are already in the countries of Europe and have every right to be there.
Could I do think there's a potential spillover on the policy-making side of this crisis to the way the EU makes policy on Ukraine. If you look at the way divisions within the EU played out on the sanctions votes, essentially the South begrudgingly went along at the behest of Germany with what the East was demanding, right? And now you have that situation reversed on its head, where the South is asking for solidarity from the rest of the EU and not getting it. And so when in the future there's going to be a need for consensus to extend sanctions on Russia, for example, I could imagine the kind of divisions that we're seeing play out between the different parts of the EU having a significant impact, given the political tensions created by the lack of solidarity or consensus within the EU on migration.
Strategic Survey 2015 covers all of this in a lot of detail. The book is out there for all of you to read. I commend it for your study. I might also remind you that this Q&A session has been webcast, so if any of you want specifically to cite in extenso any of the answers to the questions that were posed, you can look at the website and get virtually an exact transcript of what was said to make certain those citations were accurate and enrich your reporting on this morning's press conference. Thank you very much.